The village of Willowbrook was the sort of place where everything was in its place. The gardens were always tidy, the cobbled streets clean, and the villagers, though diverse in their private thoughts, conducted themselves with a proper, if somewhat weary, sense of decorum. The church bell tolled at the same hour each day, and the scent of baking scones often mingled with the cool air that came off the surrounding fields. It was a world, Miss Jane Marple often mused, where one could easily forget that beneath the gentle rhythm of village life, secrets sometimes festered. It was a Wednesday in late June when the first ripples of trouble began. The evening sun still lingered in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the stone cottages and manicured hedges as the village's most anticipated event of the season, the Maplewood Mansion charity fete, was in full swing. It was an occasion to raise money for the local hospital, an event that combined the charming awkwardness of village life with the air of elegance that Maplewood Mansion, with its grand oak doors and sweeping lawns, always seemed to imbue. Miss Marple, of course, was not one to attend such affairs, preferring the peace of her quiet cottage and the hum of her knitting needles. Yet she had been invited by Lady Constance Vickery, a long-standing acquaintance and a lady of considerable wealth and influence. It was widely believed that Lady Constance, whose considerable fortune had afforded her a taste for all things lavish, enjoyed the attention of the village's social elite. And so it was that Miss Marple found herself reluctantly perched on a garden bench, a cup of tea in hand, watching the proceedings from afar. The garden, with its rows of white tents and delicately arranged tables of cakes and buns, was a portrait of calm. The ladies of the village chatted amiably, the men discussed the latest agricultural methods, and children ran in and out of the hedge mazes. The scent of roses, mixed with the fresh, earthy notes of the nearby woods, filled the air. The village had fallen into the sort of peaceful routine that was, in some ways, more pleasant than its predictably tranquil nature. It was in this atmosphere that the first tremor of tension arrived, unseen, but unmistakable. Miss Marple was watching the crowd, noting the familiar faces, the slight tension in the shoulders of Mr. Thomas Becket, the village solicitor, as he conversed with his wife, and the anxious glance of Miss Edith Farnsworth, the headmistress of the local school. All appeared perfectly well, but the most observant I could catch that the village was no longer quite as innocent as it seemed. A sudden gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone had screamed, but it was not the usual shriek of a child who had tripped over her own feet. No, this was different. It was the unmistakable scream of a woman in terror. The party froze. Every head turned toward the source of the commotion. From the direction of the mansion, a figure was stumbling toward them, her pale face twisted in horror. It was Mrs. Lucy Harlow, the widow who lived in the large rambling house just off the village green. She was usually a reserved woman, always polite but somewhat aloof, with a taste for fine clothes and a preference for solitary walks. Now, however, she was gasping for breath, her dark dress torn and stained, her eyes wide with fear. They're dead," she stammered, her voice quivering with a mix of disbelief and panic. "Both of them. I saw them." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she rose slowly from her bench, her mind already ticking over the details. As others rushed to Mrs. Harlow's side, Miss Marple remained where she was, her expression one of quiet contemplation. The initial shock of the announcement sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd, but it was Miss Marple's calm demeanor that had always marked her as someone who did not easily succumb to panic. "What's happened, Mrs. Harlow?" Lady Constance Vickery's voice broke through the noise, her tone both commanding and concerned. The widow looked at her, tears brimming in her eyes. It's dreadful, Lady Constance. I went to the mansion to deliver a basket of fresh vegetables for the charity, and I found them. Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. Both of them dead. Murdered." The shock of the revelation rippled through the gathered crowd like an electric shock. Mr. Farley, the elderly owner of the mansion, and Miss Clementine, his companion, had been well-liked but never in the center of village gossip. They lived quietly, largely keeping to themselves. To hear of their violent deaths was, for Willowbrook, like the sudden rupture of a dream. Lady Constance's face paled, but she quickly regained her composure. "Did you see anyone else? Did you notice anything unusual?" Mrs. Harlow's hands shook as she clasped them in front of her. No, only the bodies. I ran for help, but they're both gone." At that moment, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel heralded the arrival of the local constable, young Daniel McKee, a man who had grown up in Willowbrook but was still struggling to prove his worth as a police officer. "Good Lord, what's this about?" Constable McKee demanded, his face flushed with confusion and concern. Lady Constance wasted no time explaining the situation, and Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing, found herself wondering about the peculiarities of the scene. How strange it was that a woman as cautious as Mrs. Harlow should stumble upon such a gruesome discovery at this hour, when the fate was still in full swing. Miss Marple made no immediate move to speak. She observed the way the constable took charge, the way people murmured in groups, their faces drawn with fear. The villagers, she knew, were already forming their own opinions about the crime. It wouldn't take long before rumors spread, and before long, one or more innocents would likely be blamed. As the constable began to gather witnesses, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the darkened silhouette of the mansion, its large windows gleaming faintly in the fading light. Somewhere within, a truth was waiting to be uncovered. But the question remained, who had murdered Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine? And why? Miss Marple, though, was not one to be rushed. She had no doubt that all would reveal itself in time, as it always did. The tragedy that had struck Willowbrook was, in her experience, only the beginning of something much more complicated. She would wait. She would listen. And when the time came, she would know exactly what to do. For now, though, she would let the villagers believe what they wished. And when the moment was right, she would make her move. The next morning in Willowbrook dawned gray and heavy, as though the skies themselves were mourning the violent events of the previous evening. The sun, normally a comforting presence, had been obscured by a veil of thick cloud, casting a pall over the village. The tension from the previous night hung in the air, thick as the mist that clung to the edges of the cottages and the hedgerows. Even the birds seemed to have fallen silent, their usual morning song replaced by a stillness that made the village feel oddly deserted. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, a pot of tea beside her, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her cup. She had heard the constable's official version of events. Though no one had yet been arrested, all signs pointed to a crime of passion. The murder of Mr. Farley, an elderly man with no known enemies, and Miss Clementine, his devoted companion, had seemed at first to be an unthinkable aberration. The village had never known such violence. The official report claimed that the two victims had been found in the drawing room of Maplewood Mansion, their bodies sprawled grotesquely, both with visible signs of a violent struggle. Mrs. Harlow had insisted there was no sign of forced entry, which led many to speculate that one of the pair had been the intended victim, and the other simply an unfortunate witness. Yet even as Constable McKee had spoken, Miss Marple had felt an unease, an instinct telling her that something was missing, that the truth had not yet shown itself in full. Her suspicions grew when she recalled the subtle details she had noted the previous evening, the way the villagers had reacted. There had been a certain hesitance in their voices, as if each person was waiting for someone else to speak the first bold, damning word. And yet, everyone had been so quick to form conclusions, despite the lack of evidence. As she sat sipping her tea, she was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Miss Marple knew who it was before she even rose from her chair. "Good morning, Miss Marple." It was Lady Constance Vickery, as expected, her delicate face pinched with a concern that had been etched into it since the tragedy the night before. "Good morning, Lady Constance," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but measured. She gestured for her visitor to come in. "Won't you sit down? I hope you've come for more than just a bit of gossip." Lady Constance smiled faintly, though there was little amusement in her expression. "I wish it were just gossip, Miss Marple. But it seems that the whole of Willowbrook is buzzing with it. The fate, the scandal, and now, this dreadful murder. I've never seen anything like it. I was hoping you might have some insight." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gave Lady Constance a long, deliberate look, as if considering the best way to approach the delicate subject. "It's a very strange business, isn't it?" she said finally, her voice soft. "A most unusual murder, if I might say so. One must wonder, of course, about the timing." Lady Constance blinked, her expression flickering for a moment before she recovered. "What do you mean? Surely it was just, well, an unfortunate thing. The sort of thing that happens when passions boil over. A crime of emotion, I would imagine." Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. "Yes, I'm sure that's what many people would think. But then again, that's what often makes people overlook the details, isn't it? A crime of passion, if one is honest, usually has a very personal motive. But I find myself wondering, Lady Constance, if this was not as straightforward as it seems." The older woman leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "You don't mean to suggest that it was premeditated, do you?" Miss Marple gave a faint, enigmatic smile. "I'm not suggesting anything, my dear. Not yet. But I do find it strange that no one has asked about Mr. Farley's finances, or Miss Clementine's, for that matter." The mention of money seemed to take Lady Constance aback. She straightened in her chair. "What do you mean? Surely you don't think their deaths were related to money?" "Why not?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but the slight sparkle in her eye was unmistakable. "Mr. Farley had a rather large estate, did he not? And Miss Clementine, though she had few relatives, was a woman who had lived comfortably for many years. People sometimes kill for money, Lady Constance. They also sometimes kill for love, or jealousy, or revenge. But no one ever talks about the money, do they?" Lady Constance, despite her polished exterior, seemed to flinch at the idea. "That seems rather cynical, Miss Marple. I do hope you're not suggesting that someone in our little village could be capable of such a thing." "Not over money." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, the hint of a smile returning. "But then again, there are all sorts of things that can drive a person to desperation. And there's always the question of who stands to gain from the deaths of these two." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Lady Constance gave a faint sigh, as though worn out by the strain of the conversation. "You may be right, Miss Marple. There is so much about Mr. Farley's estate that I don't understand. I know that he had his share of investments, but he was never one to talk about them much." "That's precisely the point," Miss Marple said, her voice turning more reflective. "People often hide their secrets behind a facade of normalcy, especially when there are matters that they don't wish others to know." At that, there was a knock at the door. Both women looked toward it, and Lady Constance's eyes narrowed slightly. "I do believe we've company," she said, though there was a hint of relief in her voice, as though the conversation had become too unsettling for her liking. The door opened, and in stepped Miss Edith Farnsworth, the headmistress of the local school, her typically stern expression softened by the unusual event. She had a folder in her hand, and her glasses perched at the very tip of her nose, giving her an air of unspoken authority. "I trust I'm not interrupting?" she asked, though her tone implied it was less of a question and more of a statement. Her voice was strong, despite the uncertainty of the previous day. "Not at all, Miss Farnsworth," Miss Marple replied, her eyes lighting up with quiet interest. "Please, come in. We were just discussing the unfortunate events at the mansion." Miss Farnsworth nodded, taking a seat with a gravity that suggested she was not here for small talk. "I thought it best to bring you something, Miss Marple," she said, placing the folder on the table. "A list of the people who were closest to Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. It may help you in your private investigations." Miss Marple glanced at the folder, then back at Miss Farnsworth, her lips curling into a thoughtful smile. "Ah, Miss Farnsworth, how very kind of you. You must have noticed what I did." Both Lady Constance and Miss Farnsworth looked at her with curiosity, but Miss Marple said no more. Instead, she reached for the folder, opening it slowly, her mind already moving, already connecting dots. The game had begun. The folder that Miss Farnsworth had placed on the table was not particularly large, but it carried the weight of secrets. The crisp, yellowed pages within it were carefully arranged, a neatly compiled record of those who had been closest to Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. There were names, addresses, dates of visits, and, Miss Marple suspected, much more that the casual observer would overlook. She opened the folder with quiet deliberation, turning the pages slowly. Lady Constance leaned forward, her curiosity piqued, while Miss Farnsworth waited in the background, her eyes sharp and watchful. "The list includes the people who frequented Maplewood Mansion most often," Miss Farnsworth said, her voice steady but tinged with something else, perhaps concern or a hint of pride at her thoroughness. "I thought it might give you some idea of their relationships." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers tracing the list of names. There were several familiar ones: Mrs. Edna Sykes, the widow who ran the local bakery, Thomas Beckett, the village solicitor, and, curiously, Dr. Alfred Hopkins, the local physician, whose visits to the mansion had always seemed more frequent than one might expect. Then there was the name that caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. Clementine's niece, Violet Hawke, who lived in a cottage near the edge of the village. Violet had always been something of an enigma, a young woman with an uncertain air about her, often seen walking alone, her face pale and withdrawn. She had been distant from the other villagers, but there had always been whispers about her. Whispers Miss Marple had noticed but never paid much mind to, until now. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers lightly touching Violet Hawke's name. "There's always something interesting about nieces, isn't there? Often, the ones who stand to gain the most are the least vocal about their ambitions." Lady Constance glanced over her shoulder at Miss Farnsworth, who shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of Miss Marple's meaning. But Violet was never particularly close to her aunt, was she? I always thought there was some distance between them. Miss Marple closed the folder, placing it gently on the table. "Distance doesn't always equate to indifference, my dear lady. Sometimes, the ones who seem the most distant are those with the most to gain." Lady Constance looked troubled. "You think Violet could be involved?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained gentle. "I think we must consider all possibilities. But we shall not jump to conclusions, for the truth always has a way of coming to light, in its own time." The conversation was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside. Miss Marple rose, crossing to the door, her quiet, measured steps betraying none of the inner urgency she felt. As the door opened, Constable McKee entered, his face drawn and pale from a night of little sleep. "Good morning, ladies," he said, nodding in greeting, though his eyes quickly moved to the folder on the table. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all, Constable," Miss Marple replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Please, join us. I was just reviewing the list of those connected to the late Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. Perhaps you can shed some light on a few of the names." The constable took a chair, his fingers nervously tapping on the table. "I've been out speaking to the villagers," he said, his voice strained. "A few of them have mentioned something curious." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Curious? Please do tell." "Well," Constable McKee hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It seems there was some talk about Miss Clementine's health. Apparently, she wasn't in the best of spirits these past few months. People thought she was tired, more withdrawn than usual." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I've heard whispers of such things myself. But illness, in itself, is no cause for murder, Constable. Unless, of course, the illness is something more than just physical." The constable looked at her, confusion furrowing his brow. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a slight smile, as though a small puzzle had just shifted into place. "People often have their own private battles, Constable. Perhaps Miss Clementine's illness was not the only thing weighing heavily on her mind. I wonder if someone might have been helping her along, if you will." Lady Constance stiffened at Miss Marple's words, and even Miss Farnsworth seemed unnerved. "But surely, Miss Marple," Constable McKee interjected, "you don't mean to suggest foul play in her illness?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the constable's face. "I only suggest we look at the whole picture, Constable. Illness is often used as a cover, either to hide a growing dependency or, sometimes, to mask the more sinister workings of the human heart." There was a silence, as all of them took in the weight of Miss Marple's words. Finally, Constable McKee spoke again, more quietly this time. "I don't know, Miss Marple. It all seems so ordinary when you look at it. Mr. Farley was a quiet man, and Miss Clementine was his companion for years. People thought they were happy. But maybe I've been too quick to assume." Miss Marple's smile was kind, but firm. "You have been, Constable. The facts often hide behind layers of politeness and convention. It's our job to peel back those layers." As the constable stood to leave, Miss Marple felt a slight shift in the air, as though something had finally clicked into place. She waited until the door had closed behind him before turning to the two women who sat before her. "We have much to learn," she said, her voice thoughtful, her eyes fixed on the list of names in the folder. "And while Violet Hawke may be a logical suspect, I have the feeling she is but a small part of a much larger puzzle. Something tells me that the answers we seek may lie not just in the lives of Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine, but in the lives of those who surrounded them." Lady Constance and Miss Farnsworth exchanged a glance, and for a moment, neither of them seemed willing to speak. But Miss Marple knew that they, too, were beginning to sense the undercurrents of something far deeper than simple murder. The village of Willowbrook, with all its charm and civility, was no longer just a sleepy little hamlet. It had become the stage for a drama in which each character had something to hide, and Miss Marple was beginning to see the faintest outlines of the players involved. The stage was set, and the actors were preparing to reveal their true selves. But Miss Marple, with her patient eyes and her knowing heart, would be the one to untangle the web of lies and secrets before the truth could finally shine through. The game, as she well knew, had only just begun. The next few days passed slowly, and yet, to Miss Marple, they seemed to be filled with a restless sense of anticipation, as though the very air was charged with the unsaid. The villagers, despite their outward appearances of normalcy, had clearly begun to change. Conversations that had once revolved around the weather, the harvest, or the state of the local cricket team now seemed to drift uneasily toward the topic of the murder. Even the most mundane exchanges were laced with a thin veil of suspicion. Miss Marple had always believed that the human mind was like a garden. It could be cultivated with kindness and trust, but if neglected, weeds of doubt and fear could overtake it. And right now, the villagers of Willowbrook were cultivating a rather unpleasant crop of suspicion. It was early on the fourth morning after the murder when Miss Marple decided it was time to visit Maplewood Mansion. She had already gathered enough small clues to form some preliminary thoughts, but there were still gaps in her understanding. There were faces she needed to observe up close, and words she needed to hear directly. She put on her most unassuming hat, a simple gray one with a discreet ribbon, and set out on foot, her small figure disappearing into the early morning mist. The path to the mansion was a short one from her cottage, winding through the village green, where the usual early risers were already busy tending their gardens. As she walked, Miss Marple allowed herself to reflect on the recent events. She'd observed the police, particularly Constable McKee, who had been trying hard to make sense of a crime he clearly wasn't prepared for. She could tell that he wanted to get it right, but he had yet to understand the complexities of human nature that lay beneath the surface of the simplest village life. At Maplewood Mansion, the scene had already been cleared, the bodies removed, and the house thoroughly inspected. It was a grand place, built in the style of a sprawling Georgian manor, with tall windows and a sweeping front staircase. The grounds, though overgrown in places, were meticulously kept. Miss Marple approached the front door and was greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Grace Worthington, a tall, austere woman with a stern expression and a demeanor that suggested she had lived with more than a few secrets over the years. "Miss Marple," she said with a nod, her voice crisp. "I've been expecting you. Lady Constance mentioned you would be stopping by." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with an easy familiarity. "Yes, I thought it might be best if I had a closer look at the house. You know how it is, Mrs. Worthington. One can't help but notice things when they're in a place of such significance." The housekeeper's lips tightened, but she gestured for Miss Marple to follow her inside. "Please. The drawing room is this way. You'll want to sit and have a cup of tea, I presume." Miss Marple gave a polite nod, though her mind was already scanning the room, taking in every detail. The drawing room of Maplewood Mansion was large, with high ceilings and dark wooden paneling. Heavy velvet curtains framed the tall windows, and the furniture, though well-worn, had an air of quiet elegance. Everything was in its place, almost too much so. Nothing was out of place, not even a chair that could be seen to have been disturbed. But Miss Marple wasn't concerned with the surface. She knew that the truth often lay beneath, in the places that others neglected to look. As they settled into their seats, Miss Marple allowed Mrs. Worthington to pour her tea in silence, her gaze shifting between the housekeeper and the surrounding room. She couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in Mrs. Worthington's hands as she passed the teacup, and the almost imperceptible way the woman avoided looking at certain spots in the room. Miss Marple took a delicate sip of the tea, savoring its warmth before setting the cup down on the saucer with a quiet clink. "Mrs. Worthington," she began, her voice soft but probing, "I'm certain this is a difficult time for you. Losing Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine must have been a great shock. I imagine it must have been quite unsettling to find them in such a state." The housekeeper stiffened, her eyes flickering, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, Miss Marple. It was terrible. I've been with Mr. Farley for many years, and I've never seen anything like it. I don't believe anyone here could have imagined something like that happening. And yet, Miss Marple's voice trailed off, her gaze fixed thoughtfully on the older woman, who was now clearly avoiding her eyes. I've heard it said that Mr. Farley's health had not been the best in recent months. And Miss Clementine, she too, had been troubled by some illness, hadn't she? Mrs. Worthington's expression faltered for just a moment, and Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers tightened around the teacup. "That's true, Miss Marple," she said slowly. "But Mr. Farley was a man of great strength, even in his later years. Miss Clementine, well, she did become rather frail. But none of us ever expected, well, this." Miss Marple nodded, but her mind was already piecing together the subtle nuances of Mrs. Worthington's reaction. There was something she wasn't saying, something buried in her reticence. But Miss Marple knew better than to push too hard at this stage. "I'm sure you've had many visitors these past few days," Miss Marple said. "The constable, of course, and others from the village. But I wonder, Mrs. Worthington, if there's been anything unusual? Any conversations you overheard or things you noticed that might seem out of place?" The housekeeper's eyes darted nervously around the room, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might refuse to answer. But then, just as quickly as the moment of tension had arrived, it seemed to dissipate. "Well, now that you mention it," Mrs. Worthington said, her voice low, "there was something strange. I overheard a conversation one evening, just before the murder occurred, between Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. It was late, and I'd gone upstairs to bed. I was about to close the door when I heard their voices coming from the drawing room." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "What were they discussing?" "I don't know exactly," Mrs. Worthington replied quickly, as if trying to downplay the importance of her observation. "But there was a lot of tension in their voices. And then I heard Miss Clementine say something about a choice, a difficult choice. It was the only word I could make out before I closed the door." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she considered this new piece of information. A difficult choice. It could mean any number of things. But it certainly sounded as though Miss Clementine had been facing a decision, one that was heavy enough to cause a rift, a conflict between the two of them. Before Miss Marple could ask more, the door to the drawing room opened, and in stepped Mr. Thomas Becket, the village solicitor. His usual air of composed professionalism was marred by the slight tremor in his hands and the faint shadow under his eyes, betraying the toll the murder had taken on him. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Worthington," he said, his voice polite but tinged with an edge of stress. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I've just come from a meeting with Constable McKee. It seems there are new developments in the case, and I wanted to discuss them with you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple gave a serene smile. "Of course, Mr. Becket. You'll find I'm always willing to listen to new developments. Won't you sit down?" As the solicitor took his seat, Miss Marple's mind continued to work, its gears turning quietly. There was more to this story, she was certain of it. Mrs. Worthington's admission had opened a small door to a larger mystery, one she was beginning to see more clearly. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth, though often hidden, never stayed buried for long. The puzzle pieces were starting to align. The conversation that followed was, as Miss Marple had anticipated, a slow unraveling of hidden truths. Mr. Becket, though clearly preoccupied with the mounting tension of the case, was still the composed solicitor the village had always known. His manner was direct, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most polished of people often concealed the greatest of secrets behind their calm facades. After Mrs. Worthington had excused herself, citing the need to attend to her duties, Mr. Becket and Miss Marple were left alone in the drawing room, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. The weight of the conversation, now a delicate thing, hung in the air between them. "I must confess, Miss Marple," Becket began, his voice tight, "I'm not entirely sure how to proceed. Constable McKee is trying his best, but I fear we may be missing something critical here. So many things just don't add up. The scene in the mansion was, well, it was odd. It didn't fit with what I would have expected in a case like this." Miss Marple leaned forward, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on Mr. Becket, and though her expression remained soft, There was an intensity behind her eyes that betrayed her mind's ceaseless activity. "Tell me, Mr. Beckett," she said, her tone gentle but probing, "what is it about the scene that you found so odd?" Beckett hesitated, clearly reluctant to reveal his thoughts. But after a moment, he sighed, as if resigned to the fact that Miss Marple would not let the matter go. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice low and measured. "It wasn't the bodies themselves. That, I expected, tragically, of course. But what I don't understand is how it happened. Mr. Farley was in his late 70s, frail, yes, but still a man of some stature. And Miss Clementine, well, she had been ill, as you know. But the nature of the deaths, they weren't typical. Not of a crime of passion, nor a robbery gone wrong. It almost felt like it was personal." Miss Marple's mind clicked into place. Personal? But then, if it were personal, there would surely have been signs of a struggle. A motive would be clearer. Beckett nodded, his fingers nervously drumming on the arm of his chair. "Exactly. And that's what's been bothering me." The room was untouched, almost too pristine. There were no signs of a violent altercation. It was almost as if the murderer had been allowed to do it, or worse, that the victims had known the killer. Miss Marple's thoughts began to circle back to the words she had overheard Mrs. Worthington mention, a difficult choice. She wasn't the only one to have noticed this strange sense of complicity in the deaths. It suggested something far deeper than a random act of violence. There was, perhaps, an internal struggle at play, one the victims themselves had been a part of. "It strikes me, Mr. Beckett, that you may be correct in your assessment," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but assured. "There was no forced entry into the mansion, no apparent struggle. It is almost as though the deaths were the result of a well-understood arrangement. But what that arrangement was remains a mystery." Beckett's brow furrowed, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought, chewing over the implications of Miss Marple's words. "But how could they have known the killer?" he asked, more to himself than to her. "What's the connection? It seems impossible. I've known Mr. Farley for years, and Miss Clementine, though reclusive, was a good woman. She had no enemies." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, allowing the conversation to settle, her gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the garden bloomed with late spring flowers, unaware of the turmoil inside the mansion. There, in that peaceful scene, something had shattered irreparably. Miss Marple could feel it. This was no random act. The connections between the victim and the killer were, in some way, tied to the very fabric of the village itself. "You may be right," she said finally, "in saying that the connection between the victims and their killer is personal. But I suspect it runs deeper than mere acquaintance." She let the words hang in the air, giving Beckett time to digest them. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice edged with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "So, you think the killer is someone we all know?" Miss Marple's lips curled into a small smile. "The people we know best are often the ones who surprise us the most." Beckett looked at her, as if hoping for further explanation, but Miss Marple only returned his gaze with a knowing, steady look. He sighed again, rubbing his temples. "There's so much I don't understand. I've been reviewing the financial records of the mansion, and there's something odd about them, Miss Marple. Mr. Farley was wealthy, yes, but not to the extent that his estate would be enough to justify murder, at least, not in the traditional sense. Miss Clementine's inheritance was meager by comparison. But there are discrepancies." Miss Marple's interest peaked. "Discrepancies?" Beckett nodded slowly. "There were several sizable withdrawals from Mr. Farley's account over the past few months, large sums of money, in cash, mostly. He wasn't one to make such withdrawals regularly. I'm not sure where the money went or what it was for, but it's enough to raise questions. Is there any way to trace the withdrawals?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward with keen interest. Beckett paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "Not directly. Mr. Farley was very private about his finances, but I have a feeling that someone close to him might know more than they're letting on." Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, her thoughts already moving toward the connections she'd begun to make. Financial irregularities were a common motive in crimes of this nature, especially when it came to people with as much to lose as Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. She had already noted the subtle signs of conflict within the mansion, the strange tension between the two victims. "I believe, Mr. Beckett," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, "that the answers may lie in the people who had access to Mr. Farley's finances, or at least to his personal life." Beckett looked at her, his face both puzzled and impressed. "Are you suggesting one of his closest associates might have been involved?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. And I believe it's time we had a closer look at the people who had the most to gain from his death, whether through inheritance, money, or even long-held resentments." The wheels of the investigation were beginning to turn, and Miss Marple knew the path would not be easy. The more she uncovered, the more tangled the web of deceit became. She could feel the threads tightening around her, drawing closer to the truth. And she was certain that the truth, when it finally revealed itself, would be a far more complex thing than anyone could have imagined. As the evening light dimmed outside, Miss Marple stood and smiled at Beckett. "I think, Mr. Beckett, it's time we visited some of the people on that list. Don't you agree?" The solicitor, now more than intrigued, stood and nodded. "Yes, Miss Marple. I believe that's a very good idea." With the first steps of their investigation set in motion, the quiet village of Willowbrook was no longer the peaceful haven it had once been. The shadows of the past were closing in, and with each passing day, they would reveal more than anyone was prepared for. The final trap was being set, and Miss Marple, with her usual quiet precision, was ready to catch the elusive prey that had disrupted the village's calm. In the distance, the clock tower struck, marking the hour. Time, as Miss Marple well knew, was running out. The next day, as the fog began to lift from Willowbrook and the village stirred to life once more, Miss Marple and Mr. Beckett set out on the first leg of their investigation. They had a list, though it was by no means exhaustive. It contained the names of the people who, in some way or another, had been close to Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. Miss Marple was certain that one of these individuals held the key to understanding the complex web that had led to their untimely deaths. And yet, she also knew that some things could never be unraveled in haste. As they walked through the village, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The sun was peeking through the morning mist, and the familiar sights of Willowbrook, bustling flower sellers, children rushing to school, and the baker setting out her wares, belied the grim truth that hung in the background like an uninvited guest. Their first stop was Mrs. Edna Sykes' bakery. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air as they entered the quaint little shop, where the village's sweet tooth was often sated. Mrs. Sykes, a plump woman in her late 50s with round cheeks and a ready laugh, greeted them warmly. "Well, if it isn't Miss Marple and Mr. Beckett!" she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron and ushering them to the counter. "A bit early for a visit, isn't it? Though I can always find room for a good chat and a cup of tea." "We were hoping you might spare us a few moments of your time, Mrs. Sykes," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but serious. "There's been a dreadful business in the village, and we're trying to make sense of it." "Dreadful, indeed," Mrs. Sykes said, her jovial demeanor momentarily slipping into something darker. "I never thought I'd see the day when a murder would happen right here in Willowbrook. I've known Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine for years. Always such respectable folk. I can hardly believe it." She paused, pressing her lips together, as though considering something. Miss Marple noticed the change in her expression. What had been casual gossip just moments before was now tinged with something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. It was hard to say. "And what do you think, Mrs. Sykes?" Mr. Beckett asked, leaning slightly forward, his gaze fixed on her. "Is there anything you noticed recently that might shed light on this dreadful event?" The baker's eyes flickered nervously, and she clasped her hands together, her fingers twitching slightly as if searching for something to steady them. "Well, now that you mention it," she said, her voice lower, "there was something unusual just a few days before it happened. I saw Miss Clementine in town one morning, and she was acting a bit strange. Not like herself. She seemed worried. She asked me if I had any bread left from the day before, which was odd because she usually comes for fresh loaves. And she seemed, I don't know, like she was in a hurry, like she was trying to avoid someone. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, thinking back, it does seem odd." Miss Marple leaned in slightly, her sharp eyes watching Mrs. Sykes with interest. "Did she mention anything? Anyone she might have been trying to avoid?" Mrs. Sykes hesitated. "Well," She did mention Mr. Farley. She said something about him being upset lately, that she wasn't sure what to do anymore. It sounded like there were some disagreements between them. But she didn't elaborate. Miss Marple exchanged a quick glance with Mr. Beckett, who was scribbling down notes. Do you think Miss Clementine might have been worried about something specific? Mrs. Sykes shook her head, looking lost in thought. I don't know. But I'll tell you this, there was always a lot of tension between the two of them, especially toward the end. It was subtle, mind you. They were very proper. But I could see it. They weren't happy. Not like they used to be. The baker's words hung in the air, and Miss Marple let them settle in her mind. I see. Thank you, Mrs. Sykes. Your observations are very helpful. As they left the bakery, Mr. Beckett turned to Miss Marple, his expression thoughtful. I didn't realize there had been tension between them. And that comment about Clementine avoiding someone other than Mr. Farley, perhaps? It's interesting, isn't it? Yes, Miss Marple replied, her voice contemplative. There's more to this than meets the eye. People often think of a murder as an explosive act, sudden and obvious. But the truth is, it's often a slow-burning thing. Small actions, small shifts that no one notices until it's too late. Their next stop was to visit Dr. Alfred Hopkins, the local physician. He had been one of the last to see both Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine alive, and Miss Marple was certain he held pieces of the puzzle that they had yet to uncover. Dr. Hopkins lived in a modest house on the edge of the village, his clinic located on the ground floor. The moment Miss Marple and Mr. Beckett stepped inside, the scent of antiseptic and old books greeted them, giving the place a distinctly clinical but homey feel. Miss Marple, Mr. Beckett, Dr. Hopkins said, rising from behind his desk with a warm smile. I trust you're both well. What brings you to my office this fine morning? We're investigating the tragic events at Maplewood Mansion, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but firm. We're trying to piece together the circumstances surrounding Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine's deaths. As you know, they were both under your care. Dr. Hopkins' smile faltered for a moment, and his brow creased slightly. Yes, of course. I was saddened to hear the news. They were both good people. Miss Clementine, in particular, had been suffering from a variety of ailments over the past year. But I wouldn't have expected something like this. Miss Marple studied him closely, noting the brief hesitation before he spoke. Tell me, Dr. Hopkins, she continued, her voice casual, had Miss Clementine's health worsened in the days before her death? The doctor hesitated again, clearly weighing his words. Well, yes. She had become weaker in the last few months, more fatigued. But she was still functional. Not bedridden, if that's what you mean. I did prescribe some treatments, but she never followed through with all of them. And as for Mr. Farley, well, he'd been coping with his own ailments. Nothing terribly serious, but he was getting on in years, of course. And had either of them mentioned anything troubling? Any disagreements or disputes that might have contributed to this? Miss Marple asked, leaning forward ever so slightly. Dr. Hopkins shifted in his chair, his fingers interlacing in his lap. I'm afraid I don't know anything of the sort. They never spoke of any such things to me. They were both reserved, particularly Miss Clementine. If there was tension between them, I never saw it. They kept their problems to themselves. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but she kept her voice soft. I see. Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Hopkins. Your insights have been very helpful. Once outside, Mr. Beckett turned to her, his brow furrowed. He's hiding something, isn't he? Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze distant as she considered the physician's reactions. Oh, most definitely. He knows more than he's letting on. There's something off about his reticence. People reveal themselves in the smallest ways, Mr. Beckett. Dr. Hopkins was careful not to tell us anything that might connect him to the deaths. His refusal to acknowledge any sort of conflict between the victims is a clue. Beckett looked thoughtful. Perhaps we should look deeper into his professional history. See if there's anything unusual in his dealings with the Farleys. Miss Marple smiled, a faint glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Exactly. The doctor has a role to play in this, I'm sure of it. As they walked back through the village, Miss Marple could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together. The tension between the Farleys, the secrecy, the unanswered questions, it was all leading somewhere. And Miss Marple knew, in her bones, that the truth was waiting to be discovered. And soon, it would be revealed. The following days found Miss Marple in her usual quiet routine, but her mind never stopped churning over the fragments of the investigation. The village seemed to go about its business, oblivious to the fact that beneath its placid surface, something dark and dangerous was taking root. For Miss Marple, however, there was no time to linger on the comforts of village life. She had a puzzle to solve, and she was determined to uncover the truth. After her visit to Dr. Hopkins' office, she and Mr. Beckett had agreed to conduct further inquiries into the people surrounding Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine, but Miss Marple had already formed some conclusions. She was certain that Dr. Hopkins knew more than he was letting on, and perhaps it was time to look deeper into his past, a task that she knew Beckett, with his legal background, was well equipped for. But Miss Marple had also been struck by the details Mrs. Sykes had mentioned, the tension between the two victims, the whispers of a difficult choice, and the strange avoidance that Miss Clementine had displayed before her death. These were not the actions of people who had been merely victims of a random crime of passion. There was something much more calculated and deliberate beneath the surface. It was on the evening of the 7th day after the murder when Miss Marple received a rather unexpected visitor at her cottage. She had just finished her supper, roast chicken, boiled potatoes, and a fresh salad when she heard a faint knock at the door. "Come in," she called, setting down her fork. The door creaked open, and in stepped Violet Hawke, the niece of Miss Clementine, the young woman who had been conspicuously absent from the previous inquiries. She stood hesitantly on the threshold, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her wide brown eyes searching the room as though she were looking for something that wasn't there. "Miss Marple, Violet's voice faltered, and she took a deep breath. "I wanted to speak to you. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Miss Hawke," Miss Marple replied warmly, though there was a quiet sharpness in her gaze. She motioned for Violet to sit across from her at the small, round table in her cozy kitchen. "Please, do sit down. What brings you here this evening?" Violet took a seat carefully, as if she were unsure of her welcome. She was a slender young woman, her pale complexion framed by dark, wavy hair, and despite her delicate appearance, there was an unmistakable strength in the way she held herself, perhaps a strength born of some untold grief. "I've heard that you've been helping with the investigation," Violet said, her voice soft but steady. "And I wanted to speak with you. I thought you might be able to help me understand what happened to Aunt Clementine and Mr. Farley." Miss Marple's keen eyes never left Violet's face as she spoke, noting the subtle tremor in the young woman's hands. She had seen this before. Grief, yes, but also something else, something Violet was trying very hard to conceal. "I'm sorry for your loss," Miss Marple said gently, watching Violet closely. "But you must know that I'm not a detective, at least not in the professional sense. I'm merely an observer, an old woman who's seen many things over the years and learned how to look carefully at people's behavior." Violet nodded, her eyes downcast. "That's just it, Miss Marple. I think I know something important about what happened. But I don't know who I can trust. Everyone in the village is so confused." Miss Marple regarded her with a thoughtful expression. "Trust can be a difficult thing, Miss Hawke. But sometimes, the truth finds its way to those who are willing to look at it with open eyes. Why don't you tell me what's troubling you? Perhaps together, we can begin to piece together the puzzle." Violet hesitated for a moment longer, then seemed to make a decision. She straightened up, her voice gaining strength. "I've been thinking about the will. Aunt Clementine's will." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "The will?" "Yes. I don't know the details, but I overheard a conversation between Aunt Clementine and Mr. Farley months ago. It was late, and I was supposed to be in bed, but I couldn't sleep, and I heard them talking. Aunt Clementine was upset, very upset. I think it had something to do with the will. She said something about it being unfair, about how she had been promised more by Mr. Farley, but in the end, he gave her very little. She was angry, Miss Marple, and I think that was when things began to change between them." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing in interest. "Aunt Clementine was angry with Mr. Farley? What about?" Violet shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I'm not sure. But I know that Aunt Clementine had always felt as though she deserved more. She and Mr. Farley had been close in their own way, but there were always strings attached, things that she couldn't have, things she had to wait for. I think she felt that she'd been manipulated somehow. Miss Marple felt a flicker of understanding in her chest. Manipulation. That was a strong word, and it hinted at something deeper than mere financial grievances. It suggested a power imbalance, an unequal relationship between the two of them. What did she say about the will, exactly? Miss Marple asked gently. She didn't say much, Violet replied, her voice almost a whisper. But I heard her mention that she was going to make changes. She said she wasn't going to be left with nothing. That Mr. Farley had promised her more than he gave, and she was going to make sure she got it. Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed this new information. A financial dispute, hidden promises, a change in the will, it was all beginning to fall into place. But who had benefited from Miss Clementine's anger? And was this, perhaps, the key to understanding the murder? I see, Miss Marple said softly. And when did this conversation take place? Violet bit her lip. About 2 months ago, I think. But Aunt Clementine, she wouldn't talk about it after that. Not to me, anyway. Miss Marple considered Violet carefully, her thoughts moving swiftly behind her composed exterior. Do you think your aunt would have acted on her anger, Miss Hawke? Would she have confronted Mr. Farley about the will? Violet's eyes flickered, a brief flash of something, fear perhaps, crossing her face. I don't know. But I do know that things weren't right between them after that. Aunt Clementine wasn't the same. And Mr. Farley, he seemed distant, almost cold. Something changed, Miss Marple. Something was brewing, and I'm afraid it had more to do with the will than anyone is willing to admit. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It sounds to me as though your aunt was preparing to make a bold move, Miss Hawke. And perhaps Mr. Farley knew this, and he didn't take it well. Violet's face darkened with the weight of her thoughts. But what if it went too far, Miss Marple? What if that was why they were both killed? Miss Marple regarded her with a quiet sympathy. It's possible, Miss Hawke, and it's something we must consider. But there is still much to uncover. Violet looked up at her, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you think we'll find out who did it? Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she smiled slightly. We will, Miss Hawke. But sometimes, the truth takes a little time to reveal itself. And when it does, it will come in a way that no one expects. As Violet rose to leave, she glanced at Miss Marple one last time. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I would have done without your help. Miss Marple watched her leave, her mind turning over the pieces of the conversation. The will, the anger, the promises broken, these were the threads that Miss Marple had been waiting for. The game had shifted again, and she could feel the trap closing in. But for now, she knew one thing for certain. Someone was lying. And that lie would soon be exposed. The morning after Violet Hawke's visit, Miss Marple felt the familiar hum of excitement that often came just before a breakthrough in an investigation. It was a quiet excitement, careful, deliberate, but there was no mistaking the satisfaction she felt in knowing that she was getting closer to the truth. The more she reflected on what Violet had told her, the more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The will, the anger, the promises broken. These were the keys to understanding what had gone wrong at Maplewood Mansion. Yet, as Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea, she knew that the real question was not whether Violet had overheard the right conversation, but whether there was someone else who had learned of the impending confrontation between Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. Someone who might have been driven to silence them both. The quiet of the morning was broken by a knock on the door. Miss Marple looked up, her sharp eyes glinting with interest. She set down her cup and walked across the room with the same unhurried grace she always had. Come in, she called softly. The door opened to reveal Mr. Beckett, his face set in an expression that suggested both determination and something more, something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Good morning, Miss Marple, Beckett said, his voice firm but laced with fatigue. I've been looking into Dr. Hopkins, as you suggested. There's something you need to know. Miss Marple invited him to sit, her mind already racing. I trust you found something. Beckett nodded, a thin smile crossing his lips, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yes, and I must admit, it's a bit more than I expected. Dr. Hopkins has a history. It's not criminal, but there are some interesting financial transactions I've uncovered. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Financial transactions? And what kind of transactions are we talking about? Beckett leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. It seems that Dr. Hopkins had been making payments to Mr. Farley for several months, at least up until the time of his death. Large amounts, I might add, payments that were not made through regular channels. Private transactions. And while that alone isn't cause for suspicion, the timing is very peculiar. Just before Mr. Farley's death, Dr. Hopkins made a significant payment. Enough to raise questions. Miss Marple's mind clicked into overdrive. This was the link she had been waiting for. Dr. Hopkins had clearly been hiding something, and now it seemed that his relationship with Mr. Farley was more complicated than she had imagined. Were these payments for medical services? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but probing. Beckett shook his head. No, that's the strange part. I looked into it, and the payments weren't connected to any medical care. They were listed simply as consulting fees. I've never known Dr. Hopkins to charge for anything like that before. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she pieced the information together. Consulting fees? That's an odd phrase. What exactly were they consulting about? Beckett shrugged, clearly as puzzled as Miss Marple. I don't know. But it raises all sorts of questions, doesn't it? And it connects with the strange behavior I've seen from Dr. Hopkins recently. He's been more guarded, more defensive, ever since the murder. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her mind turning. This was more than just financial irregularities. It was a direct connection between Dr. Hopkins and Mr. Farley. A connection that had been kept under wraps until now. And what was the significance of those payments? I believe it's time we paid Dr. Hopkins another visit, Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as ever but filled with quiet resolve. There's more to this man than meets the eye, Mr. Beckett. And I suspect that the answers we seek are hidden in the most unlikely of places. The two of them made their way to Dr. Hopkins' clinic later that afternoon. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the village as they approached his modest house. Dr. Hopkins was standing at the front door, as if waiting for them, his arms folded across his chest. There was no sign of surprise on his face, only a slight tension in his posture. Miss Marple, Mr. Beckett, he said, his voice low and controlled. I see you've come to continue your investigation. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, noting the way his eyes darted toward the door, almost as if he were considering whether to allow them inside. But then he stepped back, allowing them to enter with a resigned sigh. Inside, the small clinic smelled of antiseptic and stale books. It was just as Miss Marple had remembered it, sterile, but with a quiet, almost suffocating familiarity. She took a seat in the same chair she had occupied during their last meeting, while Mr. Beckett stood nearby, his hands clasped behind his back. I'm sure you're wondering what brings us here today, Dr. Hopkins, Miss Marple began, her tone as gentle as ever. And I'm sure you're aware that we've uncovered some rather interesting details about your recent dealings with Mr. Farley. The doctor stiffened at the mention of Mr. Farley's name, but he said nothing, merely waiting for Miss Marple to continue. Large sums of money, Miss Marple continued, her eyes sharp. Private transactions, labeled as consulting fees. I trust you'll be able to explain what these payments were for, Doctor. Dr. Hopkins' expression darkened slightly, though he remained composed. I don't see why it matters. Mr. Farley and I had a business arrangement, as anyone who deals in financial matters might have. There was nothing underhanded about it. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. A business arrangement? And was this arrangement connected to the health of Mr. Farley or Miss Clementine? Dr. Hopkins hesitated, his eyes flicking away from hers, as though trying to decide whether to tell the truth or continue to deflect. Finally, he exhaled sharply, running a hand through his thinning hair. I don't see how this is relevant, he muttered. Mr. Farley had, well, let's say he had some issues with his investments, and I helped him sort them out. He wasn't the most business-savvy man, but he trusted me. And Miss Clementine, Miss Marple pressed, her voice soft but insistent. Did she know about these dealings? Dr. Hopkins shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Clementine had her own set of concerns. She was upset about her inheritance. There was talk, yes. But I assure you, I had no part in their personal disputes. Miss Marple studied him for a moment, then leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. I believe you had more to do with their disagreements than you're letting on, Dr. Hopkins. You see, I think you were involved in something far more complicated than simple business dealings. I think you were the one who promised Miss Clementine a greater share of Mr. Farley's wealth. And when that promise was broken, you helped her take matters into her own hands. Didn't you? The room fell silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Dr. Hopkins stared at Miss Marple, his face a mask of disbelief. For a long moment, it seemed as though he would remain silent, but then, finally, his shoulders slumped. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was supposed to be simple. A little more money here, a little less there. But it all spiraled out of control. Miss Clementine, she couldn't let go of what she felt she was owed. And Farley, he didn't take kindly to being pressed. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she listened, but her mind was already piecing together the full story. The promise, the broken trust, the manipulation, it was all too clear now. Dr. Hopkins had been the catalyst, the one who had stirred the pot, and it seemed likely that his own hands were stained in ways he hadn't yet confessed. Well, Doctor, Miss Marple said softly, her voice almost kind, it seems you've finally admitted what happened, but I fear it's too late for explanations. As they left Dr. Hopkins' house, Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly, turning over all the details. She had been right to trust her instincts. The tangled web of money, manipulation, and hidden motives had finally begun to reveal itself. The final pieces were in place. And soon, the truth would be exposed for all to see. The sun was beginning its slow descent beyond the horizon, casting an amber glow across Willowbrook, but in Miss Marple's mind, it was as though the village was suspended in time. The truth was close now, too close to ignore, too intricate to let slip through the cracks. Dr. Hopkins had finally spoken, but there was one last thing to uncover, one final thread to pull before the entire web unraveled. As she and Mr. Beckett walked down the cobbled path leading away from Dr. Hopkins' clinic, the air felt different, charged, as though the village itself had begun to sense that its darkest secrets were about to be laid bare. Miss Marple's steps were unhurried, though every part of her was focused on the delicate task ahead. That was illuminating, Miss Marple, Beckett said, his voice quieter than usual. But I still don't understand how Dr. Hopkins fits into all of this. He clearly played a role in the conflict between Miss Clementine and Mr. Farley, but was he directly involved in the murders? Miss Marple, her eyes fixed ahead, considered his question carefully. Dr. Hopkins may not have struck the fatal blow, Mr. Beckett, but he certainly played a part in shaping the environment in which the crime occurred. He was involved in both Mr. Farley's and Miss Clementine's financial affairs, and there was tension, great tension, between them. Tension that likely led to the moment when violence became the only solution. But there's something else, something still hidden, that we haven't uncovered. Beckett stopped walking, his gaze shifting to Miss Marple. What do you mean? What haven't we uncovered yet? Miss Marple paused, her lips curling slightly in a knowing smile. It's not just about money, Mr. Beckett. That was a part of it, certainly. But there's also the question of who stood to benefit from the deaths of both Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine. Beckett blinked, then his face seemed to clear. You mean, someone else? Someone apart from Dr. Hopkins? Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already turning over the details. Yes, I believe the key to the final piece of this puzzle lies in understanding who had the most to gain. And it's not who you think it is. They walked in silence for a moment, and Beckett turned toward Miss Marple, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Then who, Miss Marple? Who benefits from their deaths? And what is the connection? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet confidence. I believe the one who benefited most wasn't Dr. Hopkins, nor Miss Clementine's niece. It was someone much closer than that, someone who was there all along, someone who was so skilled at maintaining appearances that no one thought to question them. That evening, as dusk settled over Willowbrook, Miss Marple paid a visit to the most unexpected of places, the local solicitor's office, where Thomas Becket had earlier expressed his confusion about the case. But this time, it was not for answers that she arrived. It was to offer the final clue that would set the stage for the truth to be revealed. The office was quiet, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock that had seen many years pass. The elderly solicitor had left for the day, but Miss Marple knew where to find him, sitting alone in the study behind the office, his back turned to the door. "Good evening, Mr. Becket," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying only the slightest hint of triumph. Becket turned around in surprise, his features briefly frozen in confusion before they softened. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you. I was just thinking about the case." "Of course you were," Miss Marple replied with her usual smile. "And I believe it's time to take the final step. It's time we had a little conversation with someone who has been very involved in these events." Becket's brow furrowed. "Who?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Lady Constance Vickery." The air in the study of Maplewood Mansion was thick with tension when Lady Constance Vickery finally agreed to meet with them. She had been, as expected, an elegant, dignified presence, her silver hair immaculately styled, her posture poised as ever, but Miss Marple could sense the quiet undercurrent of something far more sinister beneath her composed exterior. "You wished to see me, Miss Marple?" Lady Constance's voice was cool, her eyes betraying none of the emotions that might have been simmering beneath her surface. "Yes, Lady Constance," Miss Marple said, stepping into the room with measured steps. "I believe we need to discuss the recent events, particularly your involvement with Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine." Lady Constance's lips tightened imperceptibly, and she lowered her gaze for just a moment. "I hardly see what my involvement could have to do with their tragic deaths, Miss Marple. I was a friend to both of them." "That may be true," Miss Marple replied, her tone even, "but sometimes even the closest friends have things to hide." For a moment, there was nothing but silence in the room. Lady Constance was still, but Miss Marple could almost feel the tension rise as she began to piece the last thread together in her mind. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "the real truth behind Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine's deaths doesn't lie solely in money. It lies in the one thing they both wanted more than anything: control. And you, Lady Constance, were the one person who could give them that." Lady Constance stiffened, her mask slipping slightly as Miss Marple's words sank in. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice beginning to lose its earlier composure. "I had no more to do with this than anyone else." Miss Marple smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "No, Lady Constance. You had everything to do with it. You were the one who stood to inherit Mr. Farley's wealth. You were the one who manipulated both him and Miss Clementine, playing them against each other to secure your own position." For the first time, Lady Constance's poise cracked. "That's not true," she exclaimed, her voice rising, a flash of panic in her eyes. "I never did anything of the sort." "Really?" Miss Marple said gently. "Then why did you encourage Miss Clementine to make demands of Mr. Farley? Why did you hint at the changes in his will, knowing full well that it would drive a wedge between them? You knew that if they fought, if there was enough tension, you would become the beneficiary." Lady Constance looked as though she might collapse in on herself, but she regained her composure just enough to stand her ground. I only wanted to help them both. They had no idea what they were doing, so I guided them. I only wanted to help. By making them believe they were in control, while you were pulling the strings?" Miss Marple said, her voice quiet, but sharp. "I believe it's time to stop hiding the truth, Lady Constance. You were the one who pushed Miss Clementine too far, and when she threatened to expose you, you killed her. And you killed Mr. Farley when he, too, became a problem for your plan." Lady Constance's face turned white as a sheet, her hands trembling. No, I didn't mean for it to go this far." "It's always the same," Miss Marple said, her eyes soft with understanding but unwavering in their conviction. "People don't think they're capable of murder until it's too late. But in the end, it's always about power. The power to control, the power to possess, and the power to silence those who get in the way." Lady Constance sank into a chair, her head dropping into her hands. There was no more denial, no more feigned strength. It was over. And as the final thread of the mystery was pulled free, Miss Marple knew that justice, though slow and often hidden, had finally been served. As Miss Marple and Mr. Beckett walked back through the village that evening, the air felt lighter, freer. The mystery had been solved, the killer exposed, and life in Willowbrook, though scarred by the recent tragedy, would soon return to normal. For Miss Marple, though, there would always be the satisfaction of knowing that beneath the calm of village life, she had been the one to uncover the truth, once again. The days following the confession of Lady Constance Vickery brought a strange kind of stillness to Willowbrook. The village, which had once buzzed with gossip, now seemed to hold its breath in the wake of the revelations. Life went on, as it always did, but it was no longer the same. There was a quietness to the streets, as if the very earth beneath Willowbrook had absorbed the weight of the tragedy and was now healing, inch by inch. Miss Marple had, as always, observed it all with a quiet satisfaction, though there was no triumph in her demeanor. She had always believed that people, when left to their own devices, would eventually reveal their true nature. And in the case of Lady Constance Vickery, the truth had emerged in the most spectacular and tragic way possible. Lady Constance had been arrested on charges of murder, though the trial would take some time. The evidence, once Miss Marple had carefully pieced it together, was irrefutable. The manipulation of both Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine, the hidden financial transactions, and the eventual murder of both victims were too much to deny. It had been, as Miss Marple had suspected, a crime driven not by a momentary lapse in judgment, but by a deep and steady thirst for control, power, and wealth. The villagers, of course, had been shocked by the turn of events. Some had suspected Lady Constance's involvement, but most had believed her too refined, too dignified to be capable of such violence. They had underestimated the depths of her ambition. Yet Miss Marple, with her usual perceptiveness, had seen through the carefully constructed facade long before the truth had been uncovered. As always, it had been the small, seemingly insignificant details, the financial irregularities, the hidden promises, the moments of tension, that had led her to the heart of the mystery. Miss Marple sat in her cottage that afternoon, her knitting resting on the table beside her, as she watched the rain fall softly outside. The village, from her window, seemed peaceful once more. But she knew that beneath the calm surface, there were always deeper currents at work, hidden forces shaping the world around her. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt as she walked to answer it. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Mr. Beckett said as she opened the door, his face warm but weary. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Beckett," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here this afternoon?" "I thought I'd come to thank you properly," he said, taking a seat at the small table. "Without your help, the truth would never have come to light. I know the village has been through a lot, but your insight into human nature, it was exactly what was needed to crack the case. I don't think I'll ever be able to express how grateful I am for everything you've done." Miss Marple smiled, though it was a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're very kind, Mr. Beckett, but I believe that justice, in the end, always finds its way. It just requires a little patience and a willingness to look beyond what's immediately apparent." Beckett nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that a lot, actually. You were right. Lady Constance, for all her charm and sophistication, had been hiding her true nature for years. It makes you wonder how many people we know, even in a small village like Willowbrook, are capable of such things." Miss Marple's gaze softened as she gazed out the window at the rain-soaked garden. "People are complicated, Mr. Beckett. They wear masks for many reasons: fear, insecurity, greed. But beneath it all, there's usually something simple, something human, driving them. And it's when we fail to see that, when we fail to understand the deeper currents beneath the surface, that we find ourselves in trouble." Beckett was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. "I suppose I never really understood what you meant by that, until now. But you're right. Lady Constance had hidden so much, and we only saw what she wanted us to see. We're all so good at deceiving ourselves." Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "It's often easier to deceive others than it is to deceive ourselves, Mr. Beckett. People can lie with their actions, but it's the small, unnoticed details, the things that don't quite add up, that always tell the truth." There was another pause, and then Beckett spoke again, his voice softer this time. "What will happen to Willowbrook now, Miss Marple? How do we move forward from something like this?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with her usual quiet wisdom. Life will go on, Mr. Beckett. People will gossip, the garden parties will resume, and the village will slowly return to its peaceful routine. But the events of the past weeks will stay with us, and we'll carry them forward, just as we carry the lessons we learn from each experience. That's what makes us who we are. Beckett nodded slowly, clearly contemplating her words. I suppose you're right. Life does have a way of moving forward, even when it feels like the world stopped for a moment. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've shown me more than I ever expected. I'm glad to be of service, Mr. Beckett, Miss Marple replied with a smile. But you've done all the hard work. You've helped bring justice to Willowbrook, and that is no small feat. Later that evening, after Beckett had left and the quiet of the village had settled in again, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting her latest project as the rain continued to tap gently against the windows. The world outside was soft and muted, but inside her cottage, there was warmth and peace. The case was closed, and justice had been served. But for Miss Marple, it was never really about the final reveal. It was about the quiet process of observation, of noticing the small things that others overlooked. In her eyes, the real satisfaction lay not in the solving of the mystery, but in the understanding of people, their motives, their fears, and the truths they desperately tried to hide. And as she settled back into her chair, the firelight dancing on her face, Miss Marple felt content. Willowbrook had returned to its rhythm, and all was well, for now. But she knew that, like the rain outside, life would always bring new challenges, new mysteries to be solved. And when the time came, Miss Marple would be ready. Because, as always, the truth was waiting, just beneath the surface. Miss Marple woke the following morning to the soft, reassuring hum of village life, the usual sounds of birdsong and distant chatter filtering through her window. The rain had stopped, and the sun had begun to push through the clouds, casting a golden glow over Willowbrook. It was the kind of morning that felt fresh, like a new beginning. But as Miss Marple sipped her tea in the quiet of her cottage, a nagging thought lingered at the back of her mind. The case with Lady Constance had been resolved, and though justice had been served, something didn't sit quite right with her. There was still an emptiness, a feeling that there was more to be uncovered. Her mind kept returning to one aspect of the investigation, the strange financial dealings between Dr. Hopkins and Mr. Farley, and the way those payments had been so neatly hidden beneath the surface. Dr. Hopkins had confessed to some of his involvement, and Lady Constance's motives had been laid bare, but Miss Marple suspected there were still deeper currents at work. The involvement of other parties, perhaps, people who had been overlooked in the rush to solve the crime. As she sat by her fire later that morning, knitting yet another row of stitches with a steady hand, there came a knock at her door. Miss Marple rose with deliberate slowness, her curiosity piqued. She opened it to find Mr. Beckett standing on the threshold, looking slightly out of breath, his expression more serious than it had been the day before. Miss Marple, I'm glad I caught you before you left for your walk, he said, stepping into the cottage. There's something I've just discovered. Something I think you'll want to know. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, the flicker of interest passing through her gaze. What is it, Mr. Beckett? I've been looking into Dr. Hopkins's financial records once again, Beckett began, his voice low, and there's something that doesn't add up. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, something overlooked. But after going through it again, I'm convinced there's more to this than we originally thought. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gestured for Beckett to continue. She could feel the familiar pull of her instincts, telling her that this was the piece of the puzzle she had been waiting for. Beckett hesitated for a moment, collecting his thoughts. It's the money. Dr. Hopkins had been receiving payments from someone other than Mr. Farley. I don't know why it didn't click sooner, but it's clear now. These payments were not only coming from Mr. Farley's estate, they were also being funneled in from a completely separate source. A source we hadn't even considered. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. This was unexpected. Who else was involved? Beckett shook his head, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair. That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I've traced it back to a number of small transactions, all made at the same time as the payments from Mr. Farley. And what's even more curious is that the payments were being directed into an account I can't seem to find any record of. It's almost as though someone was trying to erase all traces of it. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with realization. It sounds as though someone else was trying to cover their tracks, someone with enough knowledge of finances to hide their involvement. Beckett nodded, his expression serious. Exactly. And what's more, I believe that this third party was closely connected to the Farleys. Someone we haven't even considered. Miss Marple's mind raced as she sifted through the possibilities. Could it have been Miss Clementine herself? She asked quietly, her voice thoughtful. Beckett blinked, surprised by the suggestion. Miss Clementine? But she was always so ill. She wasn't the type to manage her own finances. True, Miss Marple agreed, but she was not without influence. And remember, we've already uncovered the tension between her and Mr. Farley. Perhaps she had someone working on her behalf. Someone who could have manipulated the situation behind the scenes. Or someone who was manipulating both of them, Beckett added, his face darkening with understanding. Someone who knew how to use both Farley and Miss Clementine to their advantage. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant. It's always the quiet ones who understand the most, Mr. Beckett. The ones who can observe and listen without ever revealing their true intentions. I believe we're looking at someone who had access to both Mr. Farley's wealth and Miss Clementine's grievances, and who knew exactly how to keep them at odds with each other. Beckett looked puzzled, but Miss Marple's eyes were clear. We've been so focused on Lady Constance, Dr. Hopkins, and the financial dealings, but I believe the real mastermind has been standing in plain sight all along. The pieces clicked into place, and Miss Marple knew the answer now. Knew exactly who had been orchestrating everything, manipulating the situation to their advantage. She could almost hear the faint rustling of the hidden threads she had been waiting to find. Who is it, Miss Marple? Beckett asked, now leaning forward with eager anticipation. Miss Marple looked at him, her eyes sharp and knowing. I believe, Mr. Beckett, that the person we've been overlooking is none other than Mr. Thomas Beckett himself. The words hung in the air for a long moment, thick with the weight of Miss Marple's accusation. Beckett stared at her, his face pale, his hands suddenly very still. You, he began, his voice wavering. You think I... Not intentionally, Mr. Beckett, Miss Marple interrupted gently, her voice as soft as a summer breeze. But I believe you've been used. All the signs were there. Your position as the village solicitor, your close ties with Lady Constance, your influence over the people involved. You were part of the web, whether you realized it or not. Someone, I believe, has been playing a very subtle game, using you to help cover their tracks. Beckett's face was a study of disbelief. But I haven't done anything wrong. I've been trying to uncover the truth, not hide it. Miss Marple's expression softened, her eyes understanding. I don't believe you intended to do any harm, Mr. Beckett. But sometimes, we can become so involved in the machinations around us that we lose sight of the bigger picture. And I believe that someone close to you, has been manipulating you to keep the truth from being exposed. The silence between them deepened, and Miss Marple's gaze softened as she looked at Beckett. You are, Mr. Beckett, a good man. But you've been caught in a game much larger than yourself. And I'm afraid that you've been the unwitting pawn. It took several hours for Miss Marple to lay out the full details of her theory, carefully walking Beckett through the connections, the financial trails, and the subtle manipulations that had been woven around him. He listened in silence, his face ashen as the weight of the truth settled upon him. By the time Miss Marple finished, Beckett had no more questions. His mind was reeling, but he knew, deep down, that Miss Marple was right. The pieces had all fallen into place, and it was now clear to him who the true mastermind was, the one who had used Lady Constance, Dr. Hopkins, and even him to cover their tracks. Together they stood, silent for a moment, before Miss Marple turned toward the door. I think it's time we made one final visit, Mr. Beckett, she said softly. It's time we had a conversation with someone who has been hiding in plain sight. Beckett nodded, his expression grim but resolute. He knew what had to be done. As they left her cottage, the village of Willowbrook felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. And Miss Marple knew, without a doubt, that the truth was about to come to light. The final thread was about to be pulled. The evening had fallen quickly, and the darkened streets of Willowbrook seemed unusually quiet. The village, despite its recent scandal, had settled into a hushed routine once more, its usual peacefulness masking the undercurrent of suspicion and secrecy that Miss Marple and Mr. Beckett were now unraveling. Miss Marple led the way down the cobblestone streets, her footsteps measured and deliberate. Beckett followed closely behind, his mind still grappling with the revelations of the day. It wasn't just the case that had shaken him, it was the realization that he, too, had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a much larger game. He had trusted the wrong people, placed faith in the wrong alliances, and in doing so, had been unwittingly complicit in hiding the truth. But Miss Marple, with her quiet brilliance, had shown him the way. He now understood the web of deceit that had been spun, and the person who had been hiding in plain sight all along, the person who had manipulated them all. As they approached the familiar stone house at the edge of the village, where the faint glow of lamps flickered from behind drawn curtains, Beckett felt a knot tighten in his stomach. They had arrived at the doorstep of the one person who had been pulling all the strings. "Miss Marple," Beckett said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you sure about this? I never suspected him." Miss Marple turned to face him, her eyes full of quiet resolve. "I'm sure, Mr. Beckett. We've followed the trail, and it leads here. Now, it's time to confront the truth." With that, she knocked firmly on the door. The sound echoed in the quiet night, sharp and deliberate. They waited, and a moment later, the door creaked open to reveal none other than Mr. Thomas Beckett himself, an entirely different version of the man who had been so comfortable in the role of solicitor. The air between them seemed to tighten, the gravity of the moment hanging heavy in the night. "Miss Marple," Thomas Beckett said with feigned surprise, his voice smooth but with an edge of something darker. "What brings you here at this hour? And with Mr. Beckett, no less." "Mr. Beckett," Miss Marple said, her voice as calm as ever, though her eyes held a flicker of something far more penetrating. "We need to talk about your involvement in the deaths of Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine." Beckett stiffened visibly at the mention of their names. He opened the door wider, beckoning them inside with a forced smile. "Come in, then. It seems we have much to discuss." The sitting room was dimly lit, its rich furnishings casting long shadows on the walls. As Miss Marple and Mr. Beckett took their seats, Thomas Beckett closed the door behind them, his expression hardening as he joined them by the fire. He did not sit but remained standing, his posture that of a man trying to appear unshaken. "You're wasting your time, Miss Marple," Thomas Beckett said, his voice smooth, but there was an underlying unease. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's clear that you've misunderstood something." Miss Marple's gaze never left him, her eyes focused and intent. "I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Mr. Beckett. The truth has been before us the entire time. We just needed to piece the fragments together." Beckett's hand twitched at his side, but he remained silent, watching Miss Marple with increasing wariness. "You were clever, Mr. Beckett," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but unwavering. "You played the part of a concerned village solicitor, the innocent intermediary between Lady Constance, Dr. Hopkins, and the Farleys. But you were the one who had access to all the crucial information, the one who knew how to manipulate both sides of the equation without drawing suspicion. You were the one pulling the strings, using your influence and position to keep everyone in check." Beckett's face twisted slightly, but it was only for a moment. He then composed himself, his expression cold, as he finally took a seat across from them. "You've been following a trail of crumbs, Miss Marple. But those crumbs were meant to mislead you. I'm not the one you should be accusing." Miss Marple's smile was almost imperceptible. "Oh, I know, Mr. Beckett. But the facts don't lie. You were at the heart of everything, right at the center, playing both sides. You may not have physically killed Mr. Farley or Miss Clementine, but you orchestrated everything else. You encouraged Miss Clementine to fight for what she felt she was owed. You knew that the conflict between them would escalate. And when it did, you stepped in to ensure that things played out the way you wanted." Thomas Beckett's lips curled slightly, as though the pieces were finally clicking together in his own mind. "So, you figured it out. Impressive, Miss Marple. But what does it matter now? The damage is done. The village is already in turmoil. Lady Constance will be convicted, and everything will fall into place. So why don't you just walk away now?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his face. "Because you haven't told me everything, Mr. Beckett. You haven't told me about the most important part of the plan. You see, while Lady Constance and Dr. Hopkins were distracted with their own schemes, There was someone else who was quietly enacting those plans. You may have manipulated the people around you, but it was you who used your position to take advantage of the Farleys' wealth. Thomas Becket shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He was no longer the confident, aloof solicitor. Miss Marple's words had begun to peel back the layers of his facade, exposing the raw fear that lay beneath. "Tell me, Mr. Becket," Miss Marple continued, her voice a mere whisper now, "how much did you stand to gain from all of this? Was it about the money, or was it about something more?" Becket's hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment, Miss Marple saw the man he truly was, the one who had been willing to sacrifice everything for his ambition. "You don't know what it's like, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost desperate. "You think you know everything, but you don't know what it's like to be trapped in a world that's always watching, always judging. You think you can just play by the rules, but those rules, they never get you anywhere." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "I think I know more than you realize, Mr. Becket. People like you, people who can't see beyond their own desires, are often the ones who make the most dangerous mistakes." For a long moment, the room was silent. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the walls, and Miss Marple allowed the weight of her words to settle over him. Then, as though the last of his resistance had crumbled, Thomas Becket slumped back in his chair, defeated. He looked at Miss Marple, his face now drained of the arrogance that had once been there. "I never meant for anyone to die," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "But I wanted power. And when I saw Lady Constance and Dr. Hopkins fighting for control, I knew I could use them. I could use all of them. And now, everything is falling apart." Miss Marple sighed softly, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the depth of his desperation. "It always does, Mr. Becket. It always falls apart in the end." She stood then, her movements graceful and calm. "You should go to the police. They'll want to hear your side of the story." Becket made no move to stop her, his head lowered in quiet defeat. He knew that the game was over. As Miss Marple and Mr. Becket walked back through the village in the cooling evening, the sky above them now clear and full of stars, Becket was silent, his mind still reeling from the encounter. He had expected many things, but never this, the unraveling of his own role in a tragedy that had spiraled far beyond his control. And Miss Marple, for her part, remained as she always was, quiet, composed, and unruffled by the chaos around her. The village would heal, she knew, though the scars would remain. "Justice has been served," Becket said quietly after a time, as though attempting to make sense of it all. "Yes, Mr. Becket," Miss Marple replied, a soft smile playing at her lips. "But justice is never quite as simple as it seems. It's the human heart that always complicates matters." And with that, they walked on, the night unfolding around them, as the village of Willowbrook slowly began to return to its quiet, unremarkable routine. But Miss Marple knew that, just beneath the surface, the threads of human nature would always be there, waiting to be uncovered. The days that followed the unraveling of Thomas Becket's involvement were quieter than Miss Marple had anticipated. The news of his role in the deaths of Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine had spread quickly, but not in the way that she had expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public displays of anger or accusations. Instead, the village seemed to absorb the truth as it always did, quietly, without fanfare, and with a profound sense of resignation. The police had acted swiftly once Becket had confessed, arresting him without delay. His trial was set to begin in the coming weeks, but it was clear to everyone in Willowbrook that the damage had already been done. The solicitor, once so well regarded, would never again hold the respect of the villagers. His carefully constructed life had been revealed for what it truly was, an intricate web of manipulation and greed, all for the pursuit of power and control. For Miss Marple, though, the aftermath was far more complex than any trial or confession. It was not the discovery of the murderer that occupied her thoughts, but the lingering question of what people were capable of when they allowed their desires to cloud their judgment. It had been the same throughout her long life. Those who sought power, wealth, or influence often failed to see the cost of their actions until it was too late. That afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, Miss Marple sat at her small kitchen table, knitting a fresh row on a scarf she had started. The rhythmic motion of her hands was soothing, a meditative action that allowed her mind to wander. There had been a strange peace in the village since the confessions had been made. Though it was a fragile peace, the kind that rested on a knife's edge. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," Miss Marple called, her voice soft but clear. The door opened, and in stepped Violet Hawke. Her pale face had gained a little color since the last time Miss Marple had seen her, but there was still a nervousness in her movements, a hint of uncertainty that made Miss Marple feel an unexpected sense of sympathy. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," Violet said, her voice quieter than usual. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Violet, how lovely to see you. Please, come in. I was just finishing up my knitting. Would you care for a cup of tea?" Violet hesitated for a moment before nodding and taking a seat across from Miss Marple. "Yes, please. I've come to thank you." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, curious. "Thank me? For what, my dear?" "For everything," Violet said, her voice trembling slightly. "For helping to uncover the truth. I know it must have been hard for you, but you've given me the answers I was looking for. I never would have been able to figure it out on my own." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and leaned forward, her eyes soft. "You've been through a great deal, Violet, and I understand why you feel the need for closure. But you must remember, it was not I who uncovered the truth. The truth is always there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be found. It was just a matter of knowing where to look." Violet nodded, her eyes downcast. "I know, but I still feel as though I should have known. I should have seen it." "There's no shame in not seeing what's hidden from view, Violet," Miss Marple said gently. "People often act in ways that are completely out of character, and we don't know why until the moment comes when everything falls into place. We see their behavior for what it is, and then we understand." Violet let out a soft sigh, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know what to do now, Miss Marple. I've lost my aunt, and now I've lost everything I thought I knew about my family. Mr. Beckett was the last person I ever would have suspected. He was always so kind, so dependable. I trusted him." Miss Marple studied Violet with a quiet, knowing expression. "And that, my dear, is the greatest danger of all, trusting people without ever questioning their motives. Mr. Beckett, like so many others, used his charm and his position to manipulate those around him. It is often the ones who seem the most dependable who are the most dangerous." Violet's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away quickly. "I just don't understand why it had to come to this. Why did it have to end like this? Why couldn't everything just stay simple?" Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful as she considered Violet's question. "The world is never as simple as we would like it to be, Violet. We all have our desires, our needs, and our flaws. And sometimes, when people are desperate enough to hold on to what they think they deserve, they go too far. They manipulate, they lie, and eventually, they destroy themselves and others in the process." Violet looked up at her, as though seeing something new in Miss Marple's calm demeanor. "And you, how do you stay so calm through all of this, when everything is falling apart around you?" Miss Marple smiled softly, a glimmer of warmth in her eyes. "I've seen much in my time, Violet. I've seen the best and the worst of people, and in the end, I've learned to accept that the truth always finds its way to the surface. It might take time, but it will always be revealed. That's the one certainty in life." Violet seemed to absorb Miss Marple's words, the sadness in her eyes shifting to something more hopeful. "I wish I could be like you," she said quietly. "I wish I could just let go of all the anger and the hurt." Miss Marple's smile widened, though there was a deep understanding in her expression. "Letting go is never easy, Violet. It takes time. But it's the only way to move forward. You have to allow yourself to grieve, to feel the pain, but then you must let go. For your own sake." There was a long silence between them, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the gentle tick of the clock on the mantelpiece. Finally, Violet looked up again, her expression more resolute. "I will try, Miss Marple. I'll try to move forward, and I'll remember what you've taught me." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind. "You'll do just fine, Violet. It may take time, but you're stronger than you realize." As Violet left Miss Marple's cottage later that afternoon, the village outside seemed to be at peace once more. The tension that had gripped Willowbrook since the murders of Mr. Farley and Miss Clementine had slowly begun to fade. People went about their daily lives, tending to their gardens, chatting at the local shops, and attending church services. It was the kind of normalcy that Miss Marple had always known would return, despite the deep scars that remained. But Miss Marple knew that even in the quietest of places, there were always hidden truths, waiting to be uncovered. And as she sat back in her chair, watching the sunlight fade into evening, she knew that the world, this world of human nature, of desires and fears, would always be full of mystery. And as long as she was here, she would be ready to find the answers. Because the truth, Miss Marple had learned long ago, was never truly gone. It simply waited for the right moment to reveal itself. And in Willowbrook, the right moment had come and passed. For now, at least. The days after Violet's visit passed peacefully, as Miss Marple had anticipated. Willowbrook returned to its usual rhythm, the familiar hum of village life gradually washing away the last remnants of unease that had lingered after the scandal. The air felt lighter, almost as if the village itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. Miss Marple went about her days with quiet satisfaction. She still visited her neighbors, still enjoyed her tea, and still watched the ebb and flow of life with the same gentle curiosity that had always defined her. But there was something different in the way she saw the world now. A deeper understanding had settled into her bones, as if the events of the past months had peeled back the veil of ordinary life, revealing the quiet currents that always run beneath the surface. It was on a crisp afternoon in early October, as Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, her knitting resting in her lap, that another knock came at her door. She looked up, surprised, but then smiled as she saw who it was. "Mr. Beckett," she said warmly, gesturing for him to come in. "What brings you here today?" Beckett stepped into the cottage, his face a little grimmer than usual. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I've come to speak with you. There's something I've been meaning to say, something I think you should know." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, and he did, his movements slow, as if weighed down by something unseen. "I've been thinking about the case," Beckett said after a moment. "About everything that's happened. It's been difficult, to say the least." "You were right, Miss Marple. I was caught up in something far beyond me, and I never realized just how deeply I was involved until it was too late." Miss Marple nodded, her expression understanding but not judgmental. "It's never easy to see the truth, Mr. Beckett, especially when we're so close to it, and when our own desires cloud our judgment." He sighed, rubbing his hands together, as though trying to steady himself. "I've come to terms with my role in all of this. I'll never be the same. And I know that no matter what happens, things will never go back to how they were. But I wanted to thank you." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, her eyes kind. "Thank me?" "Yes," Beckett said, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped me see what I couldn't see on my own. You brought the truth to light when I was too lost in my own pride to recognize it. Without you, I don't know where I'd be right now." Miss Marple smiled gently, though there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "You're stronger than you realize, Mr. Beckett. You may have been misled, but you've done the right thing. And in the end, that's what matters." Beckett's face softened, and he looked down at his hands for a moment, as though collecting his thoughts. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, his voice uncertain. "How do you manage it, Miss Marple? How do you stay so calm through all of this? All the deceit, the manipulation, the pain? I can't seem to escape it." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her knitting. "It's a matter of perspective, Mr. Beckett. People often look for answers in the big things, the dramatic moments, the grand gestures. But the truth, I've found, often lies in the quiet spaces between, in the things that are overlooked, in the human heart." Beckett looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "The human heart?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "People are complicated, Mr. Beckett. They make mistakes, they lie, they hurt each other. But underneath it all, there's something simple. A desire to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. If you can understand that, you can begin to see the truth." Beckett sat quietly for a long moment, his thoughts clearly turning over Miss Marple's words. "I think I understand. But it's hard. It's hard to see through all the layers of everything." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same quiet wisdom she had carried for so many years. "It's not always easy, but it's always worth it. In the end, the truth has a way of showing itself, often when we least expect it." There was a pause between them, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Then Beckett looked up again, his expression resolute. "I'll never be the same after all of this," he said, his voice quieter now. "But I want to try. I want to make things right, however I can." Miss Marple's gaze softened, and she nodded. "That's all anyone can do, Mr. Beckett. To make things right. One small step at a time." Later that evening, as the village settled into its usual evening routine, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on their conversation. She had seen something shift in Mr. Beckett that day, something that had been buried beneath his pride and his mistakes. He wasn't the same man he had been at the start of the investigation, and though the damage he had caused could never be undone, there was a quiet sense of redemption in his determination to make amends. As Miss Marple sat by her fire, the soft glow of the flames flickering in the quiet room, she knew that this chapter of her life was coming to a close. The truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. But in the wake of that, there would always be more stories, more lives, more mysteries, and more truths waiting to be uncovered. There would always be more work for Miss Marple. The world was never as simple as it seemed, and as long as she had the clarity of mind to see through it all, she knew that the answers would always be just beneath the surface. Waiting. The village of Willowbrook, as peaceful as ever, was once again wrapped in the calm embrace of its everyday rhythms. But as Miss Marple watched the last rays of the sun dip beneath the horizon, she knew that in the quietest corners of the world, there were always stories yet to be told. And when the time came, Miss Marple would be ready, her keen eyes, ever watchful, always seeking the truth. For in the end, it was not the mysteries that defined her, but the quiet understanding of the hearts and minds that made them. And that, Miss Marple knew, would never change. As the last chapter of this mystery unfolded and the truth came to light, we see once again that there's more beneath the surface than meets the eye. Miss Marple's keen understanding of human nature and her subtle approach to uncovering the truth remind us all of the power of observation, patience, and intuition. In a world full of complexities and hidden motives, her quiet wisdom continues to shine through. Thank you for joining Miss Marple on this journey of discovery, and for walking through the shadowed paths of Willowbrook with us. If you enjoyed this story and the timeless charm of Miss Marple's detective work, don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries, insights, and literary adventures. Until next time, remember, the truth is always just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Keep observing, and keep reading.